Hi, I'm Leonard Maltin, and I'm sitting here with Frank Thompson, and we're going to discuss this very fine film, Hondo.
You can see the titles are already set up for the 3D. A little depth there.
Absolutely. One of the few things you could say, really, that is trying to show off 3D in this movie.
Very few tricks. During one fight, you'll see a little bit of that, but very, very little of that.
Well, there were two approaches to 3D, and this was the year of 3D. We should explain 1953 was the 3D year in Hollywood. It was the year that a lot of people hopped on this bandwagon, and it was a bandwagon that ground to a halt before the year was over. But there was a point where some people as prominent as Jack L. Warner thought every film would be made in 3D. He even closed the Warner Brothers cartoon department down that year because he thought they'd be obsolete because now they had to make every film in 3D. How could you make cartoons in 3D? Turns out they could, but he didn't know that at the time. So this is one of the films that didn't do gimmick-style 3D. The idea here, I think, that everyone had, certainly the producers, and there are two cameramen credited here, two fine cameramen credited, and John Farrow, the director, and there was much angst over this, I know. But I think they ultimately decided, just shoot the movie.
They just wanted the depth and not necessarily the gimmicks.
Mm-hmm.
The irony is the 3D process gave them a great deal of trouble during the production of this film, and Wayne was constantly complaining to the studio heads about all the technical problems that it gave them. And then when it finally premiered, it played for only a week in 3D, and then it was pulled, and so the rest of the country just saw the flat print like we're seeing now.
Right, only New York and L.A. got to see that 3D version.
It premiered in Houston, so I'm presuming that it showed in 3D there.
Now, this would have been many moviegoers' first glimpse of the actress Geraldine Page. She'd had a small part in a movie called Taxi with Dan Daly, but this was the first leading role she had.
But he has no horse. No talking.
That's a John Wayne entrance worthy of that shot in Stagecoach back in '39.
Yeah, there's very much John Ford influence in this film. It's a lot of the Ford stock company, and just the way it's paced and the way it's framed, all very reminiscent of Ford. Of course, I guess every Western ever made is reminiscent of Ford in some way.
This was the first Western made by the Wayne Fellows Company, John Wayne's own production company. He had his name as producer on a John Wayne production basis at Republic in his waning days at the Republic Pictures Studio. And then when he broke free, I think he finally decided, in the wake of Jimmy Stewart and others who were taking a bigger hand in the making and in the managing of their careers, that he wanted to be his own producer. He hooked up with Robert Fellows, and they formed Wayne Fellows Production. They had just made Big Jim McLean together for Warner Brothers the year before, and John Farrow had made another film for them as well, right?
Yeah, John Farrow directed Plunder in the Sun with Glenn Ford, and it says something about John Farrow that Glenn Ford was offered the role in Hondo and turned it down because he didn't want to work with Farrow again.
We'll be talking a lot more about him, a very feisty, to put it mildly, very feisty, colorful man who was something of a martinet.
Absolutely. And this great dog in the film, I love dogs. This one was trained by Rudd Weatherwax, who, of course, was the famous owner and trainer of Lassie. But Weatherwax was actually on the set every day for the filming of this.
Well,
with this
it was
great, ugly dog.
Good training for Lee Aker, who later worked, of course, with Rin Tin Tin on television.
My name is Lee Aker, and I played Johnny, the son of Geraldine Page. I guess I was 9 years old, and I knew who John Wayne was, because as all kids growing up, we went to see all the John Wayne movies. But John Wayne had an aura around him, about him, that's hard to explain, but you knew who was in charge, and you just knew who this gentleman was.
Now, Geraldine Page was an absolute newcomer to film. She'd had a small role in Taxi, which had shot on location in New York.
Yeah.
But this was her first real film appearance, and of course, she started off as the leading lady, a leading lady opposite John Wayne. That's a heck of a way to launch a Hollywood career. And I'm sure some of her New York colleagues were surprised that she made that move, because she had finally made a name for herself in the Tennessee Williams play Summer and Smoke. and was, for the rest of her career, very closely associated with Williams and his plays. So I guess some people accused her of selling out. I'm sure she must have heard that more than once.
Well, it's a good way to sell out because she got an Oscar nomination.
Absolutely.
For this film, so.
And of course, she's really good in the film. I mean, good acting is good acting.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people were a little surprised because she doesn't seem like the typical Wayne female lead. So there's a little bit of lack of chemistry between them as the film goes on. But she's really good in it, and you feel a little bit sorry for her because later on there's a little speech where she acknowledges that she's not very attractive.
She talks about her plainness, yes.
Yeah, and actually James Edward Grant, the screenwriter, was asked once production was underway to write that as a way to get audiences to accept why John Wayne would be going out with an unattractive
Not
woman.
Gail Russell, not
Yes.
Donna Reed, yeah.
By the way, this is bad Chuck Roberson doing these stunts here. We'll be spotting him quite a lot in this movie, and we'll point him out from time to time. He's one of Wayne's favorite stuntmen and doubled Wayne a lot. Later had a small part in several films, notably The Alamo. He was one of Wayne's Tennesseans, the one who kept saying, "Do this mean what I think it do?" And there he is. If you do a little freeze frame with your DVD, you can catch Roberson's
That was a good clear
face
shot
there.
of his face there, yeah. But stunting is amazing. I mean, because even there, it's persuasive. It's
really is.
persuasive that it's Wayne.
Yeah. Yeah, if we weren't here ruining this for you, you might not have ever suspected that.
Now, let's talk about the location, Frank.
Now, most of this film was shot in Chihuahua, Mexico. Some scenes shot in Utah. I'm assuming that this is the Mexican location.
Now, being on location in Mexico, away from the city, was taxing, I think, for everybody involved, as it always is on a big movie location. All the more so because of 3D, because the cameras, and there were 2 cameras that had to be synchronized, were enormous and heavy, cumbersome in every way. It meant that any kind of move, any kind of change, any kind of setup was a big deal. There was nothing small. There was nothing small scale in the planning and the operation of this.
And this film was in production between May and August of 1953, and so the temperatures were hovering around 100 degrees every day. And virtually throughout the entire production, these people were miserably hot. Movie making is not always a very glamorous profession.
And it was also believed in those days that for color, and certainly for 3D, you needed to wear a lot of makeup. The idea of naturalism was still off in the future somewhat for Hollywood filmmakers.
I told you twice not to, but you do what you want to do.
I think it's clear one of the reasons Wayne so liked James Edward Grant's writing was that Grant, a longtime colleague and friend, really knew how to write for Wayne. He gave him those laconic speeches, and his little instruction there to Lee Aker is perfect.
Yeah, if you read the original book by Louis L'Amour, a lot of that stuff is not in there. This is clearly James Edward Grant, far more than Louis L'Amour in many ways.
This started life as a short story, a magazine story, in fact.
Yeah, Louis L'Amour wrote it as The Gift of Cochise, a short story. Then they based the screenplay on that. And as the film was getting ready to be released, they asked L'Amour to expand it into a novel. It wasn't a novelization because he didn't base it on the film. He simply expanded it. The book was released the same day that the movie was released.
And it was a huge success.
Huge success. The first printing was 300,000 copies, and believe me, I would like to have a book released with 300,000 copies.
We should also emphasize that Louis L'Amour was not yet the big-name author he was to become. This was his first novel under his own name. He'd been writing as, Tex Burns? I think he wrote some Hopalong Cassidy novels, which are pretty good, actually. I've read them, as Tex Burns. But this was his first Louis L'Amour novel, and of course it was hitched to a hit movie, which didn't hurt. It had already been exposed in the Saturday Evening Post, which in those days was a hugely popular magazine that printed, as many general interest magazines did then, a lot of short fiction. That's just all but disappeared from the American scene. People would read short fiction every week in magazines like The Post and Collier's and many, many others. But this launched, in many ways, Louis L'Amour's career.
It really did. And certainly, in terms of Western authors, who's ever more successful than Louis L'Amour, except perhaps Zane Grey?
Zane Grey would be the only name that comes to mind. I mean, there are others, of course. Max Brand, Rex Beach, there are other names that we associate with Western fiction, but I don't think anyone was as prolific as Zane Grey.
Yeah, those guys are the pantheon. I was just noticing in this scene, Wayne's bandana, it's one of the anomalies of Warner color, I guess, that it keeps changing colors throughout the film. Sometimes it's blue and orange, and sometimes it's blue and vivid red. I'm real curious about that because it just seems to be, I think it's the same thing. I think it just photographs differently under different circumstances.
Now, for many, many years, Technicolor was not just a trade name, it was the process that every studio used for its color films. Some of the studios would experiment, usually the smaller studios, with cheaper processes like Cinecolor. But Technicolor was the grade A standard, and every studio had to go to Technicolor, which was an independently owned company, founded by Dr. Herbert Kalmus, and then they had to put up with his wife, Natalie Kalmus,
Yeah.
as Technicolor color consultant. And she'd be the one at a scene like this to say, no, give him a more colorful bandana, or there's not enough light on Geraldine Page. Technicolor needs a lot of light, or things like that. And apparently she was the bane of many a cameraman and an art director.
It is the case in this era and around this era that they paid much more attention to color than we pay now. I think movie makers prefer realism
Yes.
now. And so they like it to look good, but they don't necessarily plan all the different color aspects of the frame
Right.
quite to the extent that they did in those days.
Right. A good costume designer still does. Obviously, a good art director still does. But it blends in, and a lot of the color work would be subtler than we see here. The idea of that brightly colored kerchief or bandana is not accidental, and it's meant to be just what it is, kind of a emblematic piece of clothing.
And that being said, this is still a very natural-looking film.
Yes, it
It's,
is. Absolutely.
So it doesn't look like, say, a Gene Autry Western or something that's kind of tricked up.
Right. Now, I was starting to talk about Technicolor because this film is not in Technicolor. It's in Warner color. And what happened in the early 50s was the studios started getting tired of being beholden to Technicolor and paying the high rate they had to use their services. And the Eastman Kodak Company developed its own full-color process called Eastman Color. And Eastman Color apparently wound up being produced under a number of trade names. Because as I understand it, and I'm not a techie, but I'm pretty sure I'm correct about this, Metrocolor, Warner Color, many, many other studio-branded color processes were, in effect, Eastman Color.
Yeah, I think once Technicolor developed into a single strip of film,
Instead of the
the three strips as it had been prior, then a lot of people started adapting that technique for themselves.
But unfortunately, that also accounts for the variable color that has survived in some of these films of the 50s especially. And Warner Color is not the name you necessarily want to see in the credits as a film buff, because you know that it may not be true to the original colors as people saw them.
Although I'm very impressed with this transfer. This is a beautiful looking
Oh, it looks fabulous.
film. It looks great.
And interestingly, even Jack Warner could be persuaded occasionally that a certain film, if it was big or important enough, should still be made in Technicolor. But he had to swallow his pride for that. After all, it was his last name.
You know, I think we should say something in defense of 3D at this point. We talked about it a little bit, but a year or so ago, there was a big 3D festival here in Los Angeles, and I think for many of us who were really too young to see it the first time around, it was a real eye-opener to see how well that 3D process worked. I think we all saw more recent, you know, the red and blue glasses version, which isn't nearly as effective as the original Polaroid version, and it worked really well, much better than its reputation would have it. And so I would love to see this in 3D one of these days. I bet it's a knockout.
Now, we should point out that while it seems very ordinary and natural to our 21st century eyes that Wayne is very circumspect with this woman who's a married woman, and he doesn't think it would be proper to, you know, sleep under the same roof as her, and she's being kind by inviting him in. There's a lot of explanation about how this is going on, and it's very clear. It's not only part of the character. I think it's an authentic part of the character. He would not be intruding on her. That's not his way. And she would not be, you know, so callous as to leave him outside during a windstorm. So it all makes sense. But in addition to making sense, it had to make sense to the Motion Picture Association and the production code. The production code was still very much in force in the 1950s, and certain rules of behavior had to be obeyed. You could debate them on some points, usually smaller, incidental things, but not on the big ones.
Sure. That's why they're very clearly putting him on a pallet on the floor.
That's right.
So no monkey business.
I do believe at this time, if you showed somebody shooting a gun at someone, there had to be a cut.
Yeah.
You could not show someone shooting someone and the person receiving the bullet in the same shot.
That's true. The production code rules makes fascinating reading.
Yes.
To anyone. I highly recommend if you can find them, because there's some very peculiar rules.
And what would happen is, first the script would be submitted, and the Breen office, named after Joseph Breen, the longtime head, would send back notes to the studio and say, adjust this dialogue, change this scene, make sure that it's clear he's lying down on the floor, whatever it may be. And then the studio would either accommodate all of those things or debate some of them, or ignore some of them. And some directors would ignore some of them, too. Then they'd have to submit the finished film, and that, too, would have to be approved or questioned.
And directors in those days would do much like directors do today with the ratings board, and that is sometimes they would put in scenes that they knew would be cut so that they could bargain with them.
Exactly.
A famous example is Orson Welles and Citizen Kane set one of the scenes in the script in a brothel. He knew that they would never let him shoot it. He just wanted to have something to take out so that they would let him keep something he wanted to keep in.
Right.
And they would frequently do that.
What magicians call misdirection.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that happens a great deal today, even with the ratings board. If you want to get a PG-13 instead of an R, sometimes directors will put in scenes just to be cut.
You lived with the Apache,
5 years.
and you had an Indian wife.
Wife, squaw.
Now, here again, the issue of race and mixed marriage, very sensitive material in the early 1950s. Still sensitive today, of course, in many ways. But imagine the idea of John Wayne, the ultimate Western hero, playing a white man who was married to an Apache woman.
This comes as part of a sort of wave of what you might call pro-Indian films of this era. Broken Arrow.
Broken
Delma
Arrow
Davis
started them
film.
off, didn't it?
So you really do start to get within the conventions of the Western form, you do start to get a more even-handed approach a lot. And Wayne, a lot of people think of him as being this ultra-conservative, right-wing kind of guy, but actually you look at his films and he was almost always a kind of forward-thinking person, and it's quite admirable the way this movie espouses his relationship with the Indians, and the way he, even the very last line of the film, is something that you wouldn't have had in a film even 10 years earlier.
That's right.
Trout, Jim. It's like when you get up in the
And the Indians here are made specific. We're talking about specific tribes, the characteristics of specific tribes, of specific chiefs.
Yeah.
They're people, they're individuals. It's not just a mass of villainous savages, which is what they were for many years in many films. Not always, but largely so.
Yeah, and later on, when she is introduced to several of them, it's one of the few times in a Western film where you get to meet several Indians by name.
That's right.
And he talks a little bit about what they're like and why they're different and why they would be good for her. So this is the beginning of a different kind of thinking in Hollywood movies.
Black as 10 feet down. Did you ever see a crow's wing, how black and gleaming it is?
My point of view, I was 9 years old when this was going on, and I'm a product of the 60s. And so Geraldine Page reminded me, as I look back now, of someone who was not a hippie, but a flower child. Very quiet, very nice. She was great to work with.
Now, Geraldine Page, as we said, was a stage actress, and she was apparently a little bit of a fifth wheel on the set because a lot of these hardened Western filmmakers and actors and stuntmen didn't know what to make of her. Several people have reported that she ate mashed potatoes with her fingers, and for some reason this seems to have stuck in a lot of people's minds as being this incredibly eccentric thing to do. Of course, she also liked to rehearse, which Wayne didn't really think was a good idea. He would sometimes get a little bit miffed with her because he felt like she was being a little bit too stage actorish, and he wanted her to be a little bit more natural, like a movie actress. I think like many actors of this era, Wayne didn't want to appear to be elitist or anything, and so very much clung to he's a solid professional, he's a man of the people, and he didn't want to be thought of as highfalutin and didn't...
Right. And didn't want to let the work show.
Yeah. I think the result is that he is still, to some extent, really undervalued as an actor, because I think he's one of the best actors in Hollywood history. And
I completely agree. And the thing that I find most annoying is when people say, oh, John Wayne always played himself.
I know.
It's such a foolish thing to say, because first off, that wasn't him.
Yeah.
That was a character. And yes, he did have a kind of persona that you could see repeated from one film to another. That's true. And he was often what you might call a personality actor, certainly not to be compared to some of the actors of a more modern era. But that doesn't mean he wasn't really good and versatile and able to do different kinds of parts and embody different characters really well, because he was and he did.
But had you talked with Wayne about his acting, my guess is that he would have said, I just played myself, right?
Well, of course, his famous quote was, I don't act, I react.
Yes.
Now, here is the entrance of Michael Pate. And Michael Pate, a wonderful actor of long experience who later turned his talents behind the camera and has lived for many, many years in his native country of Australia. At this time, he was still building a resume in Hollywood, and he was cast as Vittorio, and as a result, played Indians many other times during his career. He played all kinds of characters. He played bad guys in a number of Westerns, in fact, but he was somewhat typecast as an Indian as a result of his really good and vivid performance here. Of course, shooting on location and shooting outdoors presents problems for any kind of film. One of them being the weather, the uncontrollable element of the weather. Another being the sky. And when you have a desert sky, it's not going to be the same from day to day, even from necessarily hour to hour.
Especially with these kind of clouds, which if you'll watch from shot to shot, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're gone, sometimes they're in different positions. It's impossible to control the sky, as I'm sure all directors rue.
The shot where I was standing on the porch doing the gun, that was a retake. That was done on the set of Warner Brothers.
Stop him! Stop him! Stop him!
And some of these takes, if you look closely, my hair grew real long all summer in Mexico. And when we came back for these inside and for the retakes, I've got a couple shots where my hair is real short.
Of course, there are some rather obvious, at least obvious to our eyes today, pickup shots that were shot and inserted back at Warner Brothers.
Yeah, the sky is substantially darker blue than it is in any of the natural shots.
My grandfather worked with me, and he always wanted me to know the storyline because it was pretty easy to say, look sad or look hurt, but why? Like when Michael Pate makes me his blood brother, when you're 9 years old going, ow, is pretty easy to do, but knowing where that fit in the whole story and the whole ramifications of the whole bit, that's the parts that I knew what was going on with the movie. And this scene, next to being thrown in the water, I get asked about more than anything else. Did you really stick your thumb? They just had a little balloon with a little bit of red paint or red dye, a little thick, and they just stuck it. But I have a scar there, where as a kid I stuck myself or something. So I just tell people, yeah, and I show them the scar on my hand and go on from there.
We haven't yet talked about the director of this film, Frank, and you know quite a lot about John Farrow. I'll let you take over.
Yeah, John Farrow strikes me as being one of the most fascinating figures in Hollywood history. He was an interesting director. At his best, he was incredibly stylish. He loved long tracking shots and bizarre camera angles and very moody lighting. This one, I barely qualify as a Farrow film because Wayne took so much control of this project.
Well, Wayne had a lot at stake here, didn't he?
Wayne had a great deal at stake. He considered it his film, and he had a propensity to take over the director's job anyway, whenever he could.
Except when it was Mr. Ford or Mr. Hawks.
Yes. William Wellman talked about it when they were working on The High and the Mighty, that he actually had to have a talk with Wayne and say, you need to back off because I'm directing this picture.
And Wellman was no shrinking violet.
And Wellman would have fought him, too. Wellman loved to fight under any circumstances. Farrow probably just didn't put up that much of a fight. And, of course, John Ford showed up on the set and did some directing on it himself. Speaking of Ford, here's a member of the Ford stock company, Ward Bond. He was in so many films with Ford and John Wayne. They were real fixtures of the Ford company.
Well, by this time, they'd already been working together for more than 20 years.
Ward Bond. He gave me a Spanish lesson, told me how to order dinner and how to get, the swimming pool was there, the river was across the street, and how to communicate and talk in Spanish. So he gave me Spanish lessons about every 3 or 4 days.
Exactly what I mean. I say I got a right to talk to this here Bonex Major. I don't talk to no underlings.
Major's asleep.
That's just too bad about him. I'm a citizen and I want to see him.
Major ain't had any sleep for 3 days. I can tell you everything just as well as he can. We ain't heard nothing from up north.
If you ask me, the cavalry's scared of Victorio.
Here's some other interesting character actors. There's Leo Gordon.
Mm-hmm. The great Paul Fix.
And the great Paul Fix, indeed.
To the left.
Paul Fix, who worked with Wayne in his 1930s B-Westerns, was a friend and colleague for the rest of his life. Paul Fix's daughter went on to marry Harry Carey Jr., making it even more of an extended family. Harry Carey Sr. being one of John Wayne's early heroes.
And, of course, for baby boomers like us, Paul Fix is always going to be immortal for his role in The Rifleman.
Sheriff Micah.
Yes.
Get out of the way, you Major.
Boy, Leo Gordon was just born to be a bad guy, wasn't he? Look at that
He sure
face.
was. Mean as they come. And, of course, like so many villains on screen, not at all like that off screen.
Leo Gordon. I remember one day we rode out and he talked that he had a daughter back in the States. His daughter was about my age. And we just talked about school and what am I studying. And the image that he presented was not like the heavy or bad guy. He was kind of a father image.
Gordon was a very intelligent man who later wrote a lot of scripts, I think produced films, worked a lot with Roger Corman.
Mm-hmm.
Mescaleros are up too. That makes all the Apache lodges.
Say,
Paul Fix is credited by several people with having coached John Wayne a little bit in the 1930s. Fix had a stage background, was more experienced as an actor, and took Wayne under his wing a little bit. And Harry Carey Jr. always says that it was Paul Fix who gave John Wayne his distinctive walk. I think it must have been a source of comfort and pleasure to moviegoers of this era to see familiar faces in these supporting parts. It's something I miss about contemporary films. It has to do with different approaches and different eras as well. But I'm sorry, I cling to this idea. I do. I know that's Paul Fix. I know that's Leo Gordon. I know that's Ward Bond. But their mere presence gives me some pleasure and some reassurance, too, that I'm on familiar turf.
It's a great kind of casting shorthand because when Ward Bond walks into the scene, you don't have to explain that much about who he is or what he's all about because the audience knows him so well from all these other films. That's the great thing about all these character actors. Even when they played different kinds of characters, they brought such a history with them into the scene that it just did so much work.
What'd you hit me for?
'Cause I know you.
Leather it!
No, don't leather it.
Funny that this brawl, which is a good one, appeared the same year as Shane. So that moviegoers were getting a heavy dose of barroom brawling and good barroom brawling.
Second time I've tangled with that mouthy, no good. What's his name?
Calls himself Lowe. Ed Lowe.
Now, a music cue like that wouldn't pass muster today, but it, again, was standard operating procedure then. Music helped tell the story. Music dramatically underscored the story. I know sometimes younger people laugh at music cues like that when they hear them today. They find them incongruous. Then again, movies of this period didn't use source music, hardly at all. They let the composers do the job instead of doing, needle drops, as they call them, on existing songs.
I think needle drops today do the same thing as character actors did then. It brings an implied history into the scene.
That's
so
right.
You don't have to think that much.
Talk about shortcut.
Yeah.
Emotional shortcut.
It is lodge token. Here's...
It's very pretty, thank you.
You will ride well. And he no afraid. Speak with your mother. Go to horse.
Yes, Vittorio.
So this sort of scene with him offering marriage to her and telling her how brave she is, it's the sort of scene that wouldn't have been in a film just a little bit earlier than this.
That's right.
And gives him a kind of dimension. Although he still seems a little bit like an Indian stock character to us, it's important to see what giant steps they were actually taking in this film.
I wonder if that doesn't tie up, too, with major changes, not only in Hollywood, but in American society, certainly, in the post-World War II era. A lot of men came back from war greatly changed, and they helped forge, I think, new attitudes and new outlooks, and it was certainly in the late 40s that we had the wave of socially conscious films that dealt with racism and anti-Semitism and other social ills. So I think it sort of fits as another piece in that mosaic that Indians were humanized during this same period.
Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, we see Frank McGrath, a great Hollywood stuntman, but also known to people of our age as one of the stars of Wagon Train with Ward Bond. He was the sort of the comic foil in Wagon Train. Shows up in a lot of movies, although his appearance in this one is too brief. And this is a great undercutting of convention because it certainly looks like we're in for an Indian raid, but in fact, it's an Indian singles party that we're going on.
And the music helps fool us, too.
What?
It's not good for a small warrior to be without father to teach him how to be man. This is the one I was called Emiliano. Very brave, has taken many scalps. Just 6 horses and 2 squaws, but one old and will soon die. Martesa, he's a good hunter. Never hungry, his wiki up. This is the one who's called Clue.
Now here's bad Chuck Roberson again and his horse Cocaine.
Do you think Chuck himself trained Cocaine?
He did, and used him in virtually every picture. I don't think Cocaine died until the 60s.
Chuck Roberson even wrote an autobiography that you might look out for online in the used book field called The Fall Guy.
It's a fun book. He does take most of the credit for every film he was on, but, but it's a very entertaining book. By the way, he was called Bad Chuck because there were two stuntmen who worked with Wayne a lot, both named Chuck. The other was Chuck Hayward, who was sometimes called Good Chuck, and he was also just a great, great stuntman.
This was an era when stuntmen had to do very demanding physical work, different from today's corps of stunt people who have to deal more with explosions and incredible high falls, rigging of an entirely different sort. And in those days, there were specialists too. There's some guys who specialized in falls, some guys who specialized in other kinds of work. But almost every stuntman of this era, the 40s, 50s, into the 60s, certainly had to have, as part of his bag of tricks, all that went with making a Western.
Yeah, if you couldn't do a horse fall, you wouldn't be much of a stuntman
That's
these
right.
days.
So to your eyes, Frank, these settings and compositions do not reflect Farrow's typical way of working?
This is a beautifully shot film and beautifully composed, but it's not nearly as peculiar as Farrow liked to be at his best. I think he might have felt a little bit cobbled by the 3D cameras because there were two cameras that had to run at the same time, and apparently it made it quite difficult to get everything set up. And so probably in terms of setting up a huge tracking shot, the kind of which he loved, it might have just been too daunting to do or too time-consuming or maybe not even possible. I don't know. Farrow was just one of the most interesting guys. He was a poet, a naval officer. He was a decorated hero in World War II, directed Wake Island from a wheelchair, married Maureen O'Sullivan in the 30s and converted to Catholicism, got special dispensation from the Vatican to marry because he was divorced, and then became just this expert on Catholicism and wrote all these books on the popes, on Father Damien, the leper priest, and fathered 7 children, all of whom have the same middle name, his Villiers.
2 of whom pursued acting careers.
Yeah, his daughter Mia and his daughter Tisa. And of course, Maureen O'Sullivan continued acting until the early 40s and then stopped just to become a mom for a while and didn't really go back to acting until almost when Farrow died, which was in 63.
Though, of course, she is in The Big Clock,
Yes,
his film in
his
the late
film.
40s.
Yeah, which is a terrific movie. Farrow was invalided home with typhus, and that weakened his heart substantially, and so he died in his 50s from a heart attack. Won an Academy Award late in life for co-writing the screenplay for Around the World in 80 Days with S.J. Perelman and James Poe.
Now, wasn't he supposed to direct that as well?
He was, and was removed for reasons that are murky. The last film that he directed under his own name was John Paul Jones with Robert Stack. And Mia has a small part in that as well.
John Wayne grounded me. His son, Pat Wayne, and I think he was about 5 years older. I was 9, he was about 14 or 15. We had these huge, terrific skyrockets that you bought, from wherever. And I'm used to these little fireworks we have in the United States. And July 4th, Pat Wayne and I lit one, went over the swimming pool, down in the swimming pool, and blew the bottom out of the swimming pool at the Baca Motel where we were staying. And needless to say, Pat and I were grounded for about a week or two.
Now, we're going to do another stunt spoiler here, folks, so if you don't want to hear us give something away, cover your ears.
Okay, here's Bad Chuck doing this fall, and John Wayne leaps up immediately, and it really is flawless. Wasn't flawless for Bad Chuck, though. He crushed his ankle during that stunt, and didn't want to tell anybody because he knew he'd be removed from the picture, so he completed the film with a broken ankle. When they wanted to cut his boot off, he said, "No, these are John Wayne's boots. You can't cut these." But someone finally persuaded him to do that.
Nice leap into the saddle there, too.
Oh, yeah. Which was him, and with his, which Bad Chuck did with his broken foot.
Those guys had guts.
Yeah, I guess when a stuntman in those days, and maybe even today, you don't want any perception of weakness or anything like that. You want to be thought of as invincible. And that is also good writing. That's Cocaine and Bad Chuck.
And of course, people who are concerned about treatment of animals should know that that was his horse, and he cared deeply for that horse and used him for many years, so he would not subject the horse to anything he didn't think the horse was up to.
And luckily, the worst kinds of horse falls were going away by this time because of the increased pressure by the ASPCA. There was a horrible thing called the Flying W.
Yeah.
Sometimes called the Running W, which they would actually use tripwires on the horse's front hooves. And you'll often see it in movies. The horse's legs will just go out from under them and they'll fall flat on their chins. And it's awful.
Now, you may wonder why there's an intermission card here, and there's a very specific reason why. And the reason is that 3D movies at this time were filmed with 2 cameras and then projected with 2 projectors. The whole idea was that the camera placement, the 2 lenses, and the projector placement, which was the same, gave the illusion of depth perception as you would receive it in your eyes, your left eye and your right eye. But in order to do that, it meant that the theaters were running both projectors simultaneously. Normally, in an old-fashioned theater, you had projector A, and at the end of a reel, it would change over to projector B. But A and B were both running for a 3D movie. So at a certain point, they'd loaded up the biggest reels they could, and at a certain point, they had to take a break and reload both projectors. That's why all 3D films of this period, shot in that original process, have to have an intermission.
And probably just the wearing of the glasses made audiences glad that that was the case, too.
Yes, I mean, it sold a little extra pop and popcorn.
Oh, sure.
I don't think that hurt.
But it is kind of annoying to wear the glasses, and I think you do welcome the chance to take them off for a few minutes to, to rest your eyes.
I was at that 3D festival too, Frank. I remember.
But showing it with 2 projectors means that there's more light on the screen, which you really need with the glasses. And that's what makes the illusion of depth so compelling. And when they later did this other version of 3D with, you just put it on 1 frame.
Exactly, 1 strip of film.
Yeah, it doesn't work nearly as well.
You still get some effect, but not at all like the original process.
But I think seeing them in those ways make people think, what was the big deal?
The treaty was like rustle of wind to white men. Now you tell them. We're soldiers. This I do not know. Hat. Soldier hat!
Now, I believe this was John Farrow's first time directing John Wayne, wasn't it?
It was Farrow's first time directing Wayne. He had worked with Wayne as a producer in Plunder of the Sun. They would work together again on The Sea Chase in '58 with Lana Turner.
As you said before, Glenn Ford didn't care to work with him a second time. Farrow had a reputation as quite the martinet.
Yes, a lot of people really hated working with Farrow. At the end of filming California, Barbara Stanwyck made him apologize to the entire cast and crew for the way he had acted. That's probably one of the more G-rated stories I could tell. Many cast members left stories about exacting revenge on him in various ways. He was not a loved man, and yet was a terrific director in many ways. He's one of those guys that everything you say about him, the exact opposite is equally true.
Well, we're all made up of some degree of contradiction, some more than others.
Or you will wail like woman bringing forth child, and cry out to us where pony soldiers are.
That's another one of those Hollywood filmed inserts that kind of leaps out at you. Now that fire right in the camera there, that must have looked fantastic in 3D. Because it's not poking things at the camera that works or throwing things at the camera that works. It's the idea of levels of depth. Items in the foreground positioned against items in the middle plane of action and the background that really come through.
Yeah, and sometimes the audience would just find it funny when something is just thrown at the camera.
And your eye doesn't have time to register that anyway.
And if you mean to be funny, like in a Three Stooges short, which those things are just hilarious, but you don't want to take the viewer out of the film very much by just tossing things at them. However, in this upcoming fight, you'll see at least a couple of shots that are clearly meant to jolt the audience a bit.
Well, sometimes there'd be an entire 3D movie and there'd only be a couple of moments in it. A famous example would be Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder, where he used the gimmick aspect of 3D very sparingly so that when he did really use it, with Grace Kelly reaching out for the scissors to kill her attacker, it stays with you.
But then you have the other side of the coin, like the original House of Wax, when suddenly the whole thing stops so somebody can play with paddle balls.
That's right. And God bless that
Yes.
paddle ball man. Here, too, the Indians would be seen in the foreground, and that creates a very, very interesting effect.
There you go.
Oh, there's Wayne right in the
And
camera.
there's it, yep. Yeah, so those knives would have just come out of the screen to the tip of your nose. We were talking about the Hollywood inserts that show up in this occasionally, but I think it's worth noting that one of the great strengths of a film like this is just the beautiful natural look of it, and how there's very little interior shooting. Those occasional inserts are there, but mostly it's just this great vista, you just...
Absolutely, and the color and the resolution and the razor-sharp photography, all something that we shouldn't take for granted.
As I understood it and was told, we went to Mexico to do this because they love the skies. And if you'll notice in all these shows, how much of the scene is taken up with the sky, and a lot of these shots are shot looking up at the sky and the clouds.
Now, Farrow would have been almost the odd man out on this production because so many other people involved with the making here were either, as you say, holdovers from the John Ford stock company and or members of what would become the Batjack troupe. The art director, Ali Barra, Archie Stout, who's one of the two cinematographers on the shoot, Wayne's, of course, famous makeup man Webb Overlander, and the unit production manager, Andrew McLaglen, who went on to become a director in his own right.
This rainstorm came up inconveniently during shooting, and they had to take the script back in and write a few scenes to take advantage of the rain. And of course, once he had written a few scenes, then the rain stopped, and they had to they had to go right back to where they were. But I think for this scene only, they stayed out there.
More of the joys of location filming. Apparently, they were subject to flash floods at this location, and sometimes it got kind of extreme. Lee Aker, who plays the boy here, remembers them taking boats out to some of their location spots. Can you imagine, in the middle of the desert?
The monsoons hit, and it rained every afternoon for a couple of weeks straight. 99% of the time, we drove to the set in cars, and for a couple of days, we took boats. It rained so much. There's a little river or lake just a river, a pond right down from the where this house is, and to get over, there was a reservoir behind it. I don't know what the name of it was. And it was so full, they brought in all these boats, and we all took boats across to go to work.
This always seemed like such a gratuitous killing of this dog. I'm not quite sure how it advanced the plot at all. They must have just lost the contract on the dog. Because he never mentions him again. It's not like it really seems to bother him. Wayne got along great with the crew, the Mexican crew, for this film. Of course, he loved Mexico anyway. His first two wives were Hispanic, and there are many stories of him taking food and coffee and liquor out to the crew, and they were camping out a lot when most of the cast and crew were in a motel, the Motel Baca in Corbaga, Mexico. And Wayne would take supplies out and sometimes spend the night out in the tents with the crew and having a fine old time. He seemed to have the kind of personality that drew people to him. Geraldine Page was quite liberal in her political thinking, and she was interested and somewhat appalled to hear Wayne and Ward Bond talking politics. But even she said that Wayne seemed like such a compassionate man that his politics didn't bother her particularly, whereas she said Ward Bond was just a reactionary bully, is what she said. I guess Wayne's, just his basic character and his basic honesty really won over even people who disagreed with him fundamentally.
And that continued to the end of his life.
Yeah.
There are many stories of co-stars who've given interviews then and since, thinking they weren't going to like him because his reputation preceded him. And sometimes they had mistaken impressions of him and what he would be like. And almost to a person, they wound up being completely won over.
Yeah, I interviewed Kirk Douglas about that one time. They worked together on the War Wagon. And Douglas was just crazy about him. So they couldn't have been more opposite about their points of view. And I remember my friend Karen Morley, who was blacklisted in the 50s and was very much part of the Communist Party in the 30s and 40s. And I asked her about Wayne one time. She said, I liked Wayne a lot. And I said, didn't he make you mad? She said, no, he was honest. He said what he...
Well, that's just it. I don't think he towed to any party line. Yeah. I think he was an individual, and he had his own opinions, and he had his beliefs, and he was sincere about them, and not a proselytizer and not a drum beater particularly. I think he said what he felt, and you didn't always agree with it, obviously. Not everybody would, but he was who he was. Or to quote his character, a man ought to do what he thinks is best.
Why not?
I can't swim.
You can't what?
I can't swim.
How old are you?
6.
Well, it's understandable why Lee Aker remembers this scene.
This is the other scene that I get asked about. Did John Wayne actually teach me to swim? I knew how to swim, but they wanted me to look like I didn't know how to swim. But I remember him telling me, actually do this and bob up and down. This is right across the street from the motel we were at. That's the river I'd mentioned that flooded.
Well, how will he get back?
Swim.
Well, he might drown.
Well, then you go.
I love this little exchange where Geraldine Page says, I can't swim either. And that little look back and forth, and then she runs off. It's a great line.
The Western was undergoing quite a number of changes in the 1950s. It was becoming more adult, more complex. The B-Western was starting to die off, giving way to television. And the A-level Westerns that Hollywood was making no longer relied on cliches and stereotypes. We started seeing that with films in 1950 like Broken Arrow, which was very sympathetic to Indians and had a key Indian character. And then Winchester 73. And the year before this film came out, High Noon appeared. Still a landmark film. And John Wayne, in fact, accepted Gary Cooper's Oscar. Cooper couldn't be there at the ceremony, and Wayne accepted the Oscar, although in later years he said he didn't like High Noon because he said the moment that Cooper took off his sheriff's badge and ground it into the dirt with his boot, he thought was a very bad symbolic gesture.
Well, Wayne and Howard Hawks developed Rio Bravo in direct response to High Noon, about a sheriff who keeps getting offered help and refuses it because he wants to do the job himself. And of course, one of the most entertaining Westerns ever made, but really the opposite side of the coin from High Noon.
I guess Miss Page was something of a bohemian.
That's what they say. We don't know if it was just to get into character or what, but several people who worked on the film said that she seemed reluctant to bathe or brush her teeth. And Wayne was often quoted as saying that it made him quite queasy to have to do love scenes with her. We can only look on the bright side and assume that she was doing it just to try to really live in the skin of a pioneer woman.
Oddly enough, having made this film, an unlikely choice for them and for her, she wound up with an Academy Award nomination. And then, even more oddly, didn't make another film till 1961.
And that was Summer and Smoke, wasn't it?
That was Summer and Smoke, and then she did Sweet Bird of Youth and Toys in the Attic. All parts that she had played on stage.
And I believe finally won an Oscar for Trip to Bountiful.
Extraordinary. 31 films in all, 7 nominations, and finally did win it for a wonderful performance in The Trip to Bountiful. I remember it clearly, too, because I was working then, as now, at Entertainment Tonight, and one of our producers had the bright idea of putting a camera crew in New York with members of the theatrical troupe she was then working with, mostly younger people. And they were in a bar watching the Oscar show on TV, and when she won, they just went nuts. They were so happy and so proud, and then she mentioned them in her speech and sent them greetings. It was truly a jubilant moment that we got to see on both coasts simultaneously.
By contrast, when John Wayne was phoned and told that she had been nominated for an Oscar, he was just dumbfounded. He was apparently just completely confused by that.
It's 8 of them, I'd say, or maybe 9.
There's something in those trees.
Well, that's a squirrel. Hard talking wolf, you know. He's put out. There's 9 of them.
I love you. I suppose I shouldn't have said that.
Interestingly, we shouldn't forget that Geraldine Page did work with another Western icon, Clint Eastwood, in one of his most interesting and unusual films, The Beguiled.
Absolutely.
A film he's very fond of. Don Siegel, the director, is very fond of, that I like quite a bit, too. An odd movie, to be sure, but an interesting one.
She's one of the few actresses you can think of who worked with John Wayne and Clint Eastwood and Woody Allen.
I guess I got to feel the same way, but once in a while a fella's got to.
Wayne, I think, was always interesting and almost unique among Hollywood leading men in that he always liked to have strong leading women. His leading women were almost always his equal in character and also sometimes in strength. And this makes this film a little bit of an anomaly because she just seems a little odder, I guess, than, say, Maureen O'Hara or Gail Russell. She's just got this kind of peculiar personality, which makes the film interesting. It just makes it a little atypical. And this young cavalry officer always reminds me of any number of John Ford films. He has sort of arrogant, untested young officers who get into more trouble than they bargain for.
Cavalry. I don't reckon I know this here
Oh,
lady.
this is Miss Lowe, Lieutenant.
You people are lucky. Obviously, Vittorio and his renegade...
Now there's James Arness.
Vittorio's been here lots.
Arness, who was a protege of John Wayne's and was under contract to Wayne for several years.
And he had already worked with Wayne in Big Jim McLean and would work with him in Island in the Sky and others. And of course, later when Gunsmoke was being made, the role was offered to John Wayne, and Wayne himself made sure that Arness was cast as Marshal Matt Dillon.
And then introduced him to the television audience in a very memorable on-camera moment where one of the biggest movie stars in the world appeared on television, not a usual happening then in the mid-50s, and introduced us all to the man who was going to star as Matt Dillon on television's Gunsmoke. And what I'll never forget about seeing that for the first time was a man walking into frame who was taller than John Wayne.
That turned out to be a pretty good gig for Arness. A little bit of job security on that one.
Just a bit, 20 years.
Yeah. Now, Arness talked about how horribly hot it was throughout the production, and they were all staying in the same motel, and they would all rush back to the bar, and Arness said that they would order anything as long as it had ice in it. It didn't matter what the drink was. What they hadn't counted on was when the ice melted, it turned into water, and it gave them all Montezuma's Revenge. And so Arness, along with several other cast members, were violently ill throughout this entire film. The entire time on production, they just felt terrible. Again, show business not always as glamorous as we think.
This country looked so beautiful, but it was so hot. And this was a rough, location, and the food wasn't very good, and we weren't supposed to drink the water. So they end up flying me milk every day. When they send the rushes up to El Paso, the pilots would turn around and bring me milk from El Paso, so I'd have milk and nourishment to drink.
There's something about this place. I know what it reminds me of.
My ranch.
In California. I shot a deer right off your front porch on a butte just like that, with the creek down below and the mesas all spreading out.
Made me pack it back.
You have a place that looks like this?
East of San Dimas.
He has a California ranch in San Dimas, he says, and I guess outside of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, that's the only mention of San Dimas in the history of the movies.
The Chamber of Commerce ought to
they should be very proud of
some sort of citation.
Did I get you that day I'd have set your son? That's the last morning you'd ever seen.
No one could ignore television in the 50s. It's one of the reasons 3D was thought to be the savior of Hollywood, because in the late 40s, in the post-war, the immediate post-war years, there was a tremendous boom in moviegoing. Moviegoing had been very strong during the war. Everyone living on the home front escaped their troubles and escaped the newscast by going to the movies. The soldiers who returned home, got married, started raising families, all went to the movies. I think 1947, 48 were two of the biggest box office years in the history of motion pictures. And then the trend began to reverse because, for one thing, television came along. Television, which might have come along sooner had it not been for the war. But by the late 40s, both Milton Berle and Howdy Doody were on the air, and it was a sensation. And it was keeping people home who had up to then gone to the movies sometimes 2 to 3 times a week. This sounds amazing today, I'm sure, to younger people who don't know about this or didn't have their parents tell them about it, or their grandparents. But at one time, local theaters, neighborhood theaters, would change their bills 3 times a week. And Hollywood fed that machine. And that doesn't mean they made nothing but A movies. They made a lot of films that could just be called fodder to meet that need, that enormous appetite. And it started to change in the 50s. Of course, other things happened too. The government ordered the movie studios to divest their holdings in motion picture theaters. And that helped to dismantle the studio system. So fewer movies were being made in the 50s. And to get audiences back in theaters, they thought the thing to do was to make them bigger. Literally bigger. CinemaScope and other widescreen processes, 3D. But eventually, Hollywood made its peace with television in more ways than one.
And now those great, huge CinemaScope films we only see as letterboxed prints on our
That's right.
on our TV. So TV One, I think the baby boom also had a great deal to do with that too, because suddenly all these people coming home from the war, having babies, not feeling like going to the theater that much
That's
because
right.
they have a house full of kids. And TV was right there to entertain at home. And so it became very much a perilous time in Hollywood.
That's right. The security that many actors had felt from being under contract, all that was undermined by the early 50s. The studio started discontinuing those rosters of stars and contract players, supporting players. And at the same time, with the landmark deal that the famous agent Lew Wasserman made for his client Jimmy Stewart with Universal
Sure.
on Winchester 73, Stewart became the co-owner of his movies, and that changed the playing field too. Suddenly, a lot of stars were no longer salaried employees, but they were running the show or helping to run the show. And John Wayne's deal with Warner Brothers was, I believe, unprecedented.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting to note that one of the reasons John Wayne wanted to become his own producer was that he really felt that his days were numbered as a star. As funny as it seems to us today, because clearly he remained a major star until the day he died, practically.
And
But,
is still.
Yeah, and is still probably one of the biggest stars in Hollywood. But at this time, 1953, he's in his 40s and starting to think that his days are numbered and that he should start to look for something else to do, and wanted to direct and wanted to produce.
No one has any control over the way they feel.
It's funny how many times he got thrust back into acting. As we said earlier, Glenn Ford was offered this role, wouldn't take it. John Wayne stepped in. Spencer Tracy was cast in The High and the Mighty, had to drop out. John Wayne had to step in. Robert Mitchum was fired off Blood Alley for horseplay, as they said, and then Wayne had to step in on that. So even the movies that he didn't intend to be in at all, he ended up having to show up. Same thing even for his own film, The Alamo. He really wanted to play at most a cameo role in that, but because it was going to be so expensive, all the backers said, you got to star in it, otherwise we'll never make any money on this thing.
You're going to tell him?
If I don't, somebody else will. And I gotta...
Wayne found his first stardom in Westerns. The Big Trail in 1930 gave him his first lead when Raoul Walsh plucked him from obscurity, some say with a nudge from John Ford, who was keeping an eye on young Wayne. Then he starred in quite a number of grade B Westerns, grade Z Westerns too.
Sure.
All through the decade of the 1930s, he made almost nothing but Westerns. And then it was a Western that actually cemented his stardom. That, of course, was John Ford's Stagecoach in 1939. But after that, he did a little bit of everything. Fair number of war movies,
Sure.
contemporary films, period films. He even went underwater for Cecil B. DeMille and Reap the Wild Wind.
You know, it's hard to think of an actor being given that much of a chance these days, because if you had looked at John Wayne in the mid-30s, you would have thought he's just completely relegated to this B-Western,
Right, having been the
Poverty Row
lead.
stuff.
Right, having been the lead in his first film, essentially. I mean, he had bit parts, walk-ons in earlier films. But his first role of any consequence was the starring role in The Big Trail, which was an enormous undertaking and a big, big movie for Fox in 1930. And he went from stardom to obscurity.
And an entire decade of these low-budget, unpretentious little
He kind of
nothings. You know?
gained his footing again in Westerns and then became known in Westerns, slightly better ones as the decade went on. But he always returned to the Western. He never completely forsook it.
Even unto his last film.
That's right, The Shootist.
And then you come along and you're good and fine and everything that Ed could never hope to be. And now with your vanity, you want to spoil Johnny's chance.
The role of women in the West is fascinating. And the quality of those women, the pioneer women, is, I think, a source of constant interest and amazement. What these women had to endure, the strength they had to have, the inner strength as well as the physical strength. And some of that's expressed in this film and certainly in this climactic speech by Geraldine Page about what she endured in a loveless marriage.
Now, you would think that those kind of stories would be leapt upon today, but in fact, the 50s seem to have addressed those kind of things much more forthrightly. Thinking of films like Wellman's Westward the Women, The Guns of Fort Petticoat. A lot of films showed really rugged pioneer women and what they had to endure.
It's sort of interesting seeing Wayne being on the opposite side of scenes with cavalrymen, having worked, of course, in John Ford's wonderful cavalry trilogy. She wore a yellow ribbon and Fort Apache and Rio Grande.
It's one of Wayne's great strengths as an actor, I think, that you buy him no matter where the plot puts him. You always believe that he's absolutely where he should be and a fully dimensional human.
Well, I think you have to give him credit, too, for having good instincts much of the time and picking good roles. Of course, we can't forget that the 50s was also the decade where he played Omar Khayyam, Townsend Harris. Not the likeliest parts of his career. And I'm sure he took his lumps for trying that, but how many people would even dare to do that?
Yeah, he guarded his image very closely, I think, but even so was quite adventurous in the sort of things that he would take on. And even earlier in the John Ford film, Long Voyage Home, plays it with a Swedish accent. Only because we know him so well as John Wayne does that not quite work, but if we didn't, he sells it pretty darn well.
And that's a wonderful film.
Yeah.
I think that's a really an underappreciated film, The Long Voyage Home.
Oh, sure.
On every level.
Join in and keep moving.
So many scenes like this remind me of the sort of casual impact of 3D when you see it in its reality. Just when somebody rides close to the camera like that, just the depth it brings to the scene. Nothing that you would even really think twice about just looking at it flat like this. It's really an effective
And
medium.
having one figure or one bush in the foreground, that foreground placement, an essential part of 3D and its effectiveness.
Hurry it up! Hurry it up!
They hired people from the local town, hundreds of them, and they brought in the horses. And they did these scenes. I mean, there was no stock shots. That was what was going on. They were just goofing off most of the time, and in between takes, you'd hear the guns going off. And then they had to take the ammunition away from them when they weren't actually doing the scenes, because they were just playing.
Now, John Ford had a habit of visiting Wayne's locations, unbidden.
Yeah, to Wayne's chagrin.
Yes.
Usually. And he showed up here. Wayne, as he would later do on the Alamo, didn't have the heart to just tell him to go away, and maybe didn't have the backbone to tell him to go away. I think Ford was one of the few people that Wayne was actually afraid of. But he assigned him to do second unit footage. And Ford shot a lot of second unit footage, and apparently a great deal of this battle scene.
I watched all this, and I was sitting right next to John Ford, who was on this kind of crane lift. And he was directing all this with a big bullhorn. He had the second unit over here and the unit over here. And it was, just like watching a band leader or an orchestra leader doing all this, because he had everything was just working. He worked it all. He had this aura or something about him, an aura of confidence. He knew what was going on and knew how to get it.
James Arness tells a story about an arrow that comes into the wagon. You'll see it in a moment, that hits just next to where Arness is. And Ford brought on the archer, this champion archer who was going to shoot the arrow. And he was wearing thick glasses and was cross-eyed. And Ford introduced him as the great archer who's going to be firing this sharp arrow at Arness. And, of course, Arness had quite a few moments of trepidation, even though he suspected it was one of Ford's practical jokes, which it was. Otherwise, Arness's career would have ended here.
Back in beautiful downtown Burbank, Jack Warner was seeing rushes and expressing great concern not at the quality of the movie itself, but at the fact that it was taking so long and costing so much to make. And he had a lot riding on this film. It was a big investment, and of course it was a 3D movie set to come out in November and December. And by this time it was obvious that the 3D fad was expiring.
And it's funny because it only took 4 months, less than 4 months to shoot, which is a little long for a film, 80 minutes long, but nevertheless, it doesn't seem excessive. So Warner must have been hoping for much, much faster work on this than he got.
But Jack Warner need not have worried. The film was an enormous success, not only in the U.S., but around the world. More than made its money back, and that was good news for John Wayne and Robert Fellows, too. Nowadays, movies open on 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 screens all at once. It was not that way then. They had the premiere on November 23rd in Houston. It opened later that week in New York City and didn't open in L.A. until a month after that.
We're about to see Bad Chuck Roberson's last appearance in the film, at least as far as I know. He's a cavalry man in the wagon. There he is. The only time you actually get a good shot at his face. But in this film, Chuck has been Hondo, several Indians, and at least one cavalry officer. And did a splendid job with all of them.
Of course, when this film was made, there was no thought of afterlife to movies. I mean, television had already started showing movies, notably when it revived the career of Hopalong Cassidy, William Boyd, at the very beginning of television. But that was the kind of product that was being sold to TV then. B-movies, westerns, and foreign films, British films, which were considered of little value. That's what filled the airwaves, plus old cartoons, old comedy shorts. But a major feature film, never.
And this one was kept off the air for years, too. Batjack always considered this apparently a special film, and it got very limited TV airing over the years, and for the last decade or so, I don't think it's aired at all.
Well, of course, it did run one time in 3D.
In 1989. You had to go to 7-Eleven to pick up your glasses.
That's right. It was a very big campaign.
And it was fairly acceptable as 3D, but I don't think it really gave more than just an idea of what the process really should be.
By 1955-56, Jack Warner was changing his mind about a lot of things. He sold his entire pre-1949 film library for a lump sum, and then started making television films, essentially series. He made something called Warner Brothers Presents that got to plug new Warner Brothers movies coming out, including John Wayne's The Searchers, but also recycled Warner properties like Casablanca and Kings Row. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon, Warner Brothers was the busiest studio in town, making almost nothing but westerns. It was the house of westerns in the late 50s.
Yeah, they all started with that aerial shot of the Warner Brothers studios. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm never on that lot that I don't think of myself at 5 years old watching Cheyenne or something.
That's right. I feel the same way. And of course, no one could have foreseen such a thing as home video, let alone a DVD where a couple of film buffs could sit here yammering away during the course of a movie.
Yeah, so many of the old directors have said later, if I'd known you guys were going to be watching this stuff so much, I would have been more careful about it.
But quite seriously, they didn't think about an afterlife. I mean, really big hit movies would get reissued. That did happen. Public Enemy, Frankenstein, Stagecoach. So that was certainly part of the industry for years and years and years. But those were special events, special occasions for the most part. The idea of getting to see a film, to own a film, to examine a film microscopically, never could have entered their mind.
End of a way of life. Too bad. It's a good way. Wagons forward! Yeah.
I think it's indicative of the way Geraldine Page is treated in this film, that there is no traditional fade-out kiss or
The final clinch.
No
That's
final
right.
clinch, no nothing. They are heading off to the same place, to his ranch in San Dimas, but he's riding ahead. She's back in the wagon. It's very much going to be a modern relationship, I think.